There's a version of King Arthur who never died. After his final battle, mortally wounded, Arthur is carried away to Avalon. It's a story without closure, as it refuses to bury him. Depending on which version you've read, Arthur is sleeping, healing, waiting, until one day, when Britain needs him badly enough, it's said that the king will return. It's a lovely idea, especially if you live in a country that feels like it's seen better days, because let's be honest, repairing a country and taking action is difficult, whilst waiting for the right person to turn up, well, that's considerably easier. Searching British history for universally admired leaders capable of national restoration. Estimated completion time indefinite. Cancel the search archive. Don't you know that we've got Burnham now? He likes a pint and he's a fan of pork scratchings. And did you know he's a DJ as well? We should get Deadmau5 to lead us. I'm not sure Joel's the right man for the job, but a king version of his mouse head would look pretty glorious. I think so too. Anyway, we're getting distracted. This is a King Arthur video, and we all sort of know King Arthur. Camelot, Merlin, Excalibur, the sword in the stone. I mean, I even made a crappy parallax tutorial about that over half a decade ago. It works though. And then there's Guinevere and Lancelot and the Knights of the Round Table, the Holy Grail, Mordred, Avalon. Except there's a problem. That King Arthur never appears in one original story. He was built. Different writers in different countries across hundreds of years that just kept adding pieces. One gives him a kingdom, another gives him a round table, someone else brings in Lancelot, and then the Grail wanders in. The romances get bigger and Camelot, it gets grander. And somewhere underneath all of that is a very frustrating question historians have been arguing about for a very, very long time. Was there actually an Arthur? Because if there was, he probably wouldn't recognize himself. Go back far enough and the world around Arthur looks nothing like Camelot. Roman rule in Britain had ended in the early 15th century, and what followed was a patchwork of British kingdoms, shifting alliances, migration, warfare, and expanding Anglo-Saxon power. Somewhere in that period, around the late 5th or 6th century, the historical Arthur is supposed to belong, if he existed at all, and our sources are not especially helpful. One of the frustrating ones in particular is Gildas, a 6th century British writer who describes the Battle of Badon, a major British victory over the Saxons. This is exactly the sort of event where you'd hope the hero of the story might actually appear, but he doesn't. And then a few centuries later, things change. Around the year 829, the Historia Britonum, the history of Britons, gives us an Arthur, but he isn't introduced as this majestic king of Camelot. He's a military leader fighting along the king of the Britons. 12 battles are actually attributed to him. At Badon, the story claims he kills an absurd number of enemies himself, which is usually where history quietly starts putting on a cape. Later Welsh annals connect Arthur with Badon and place his death alongside Madrout, the figure who eventually becomes Mordred at the Battle of Camlan. So there might be something down there. A war leader, a regional ruler, several different people whose stories kind of get tangled together, or perhaps Arthur was already a legend by the time anyone wrote these things down. We just don't know. And weirdly, that uncertainty might have actually helped him, because a badly documented Arthur is extremely easy to improve. Originally a military leader who was really good at fighting Saxons. Wow, his DLC is insanely impressive. Yeah, that's one way of putting it, because in the 12th century, Arthur actually got a major upgrade. Geoffrey of Monmouth writes the history of the kings of Britain around 1138, and Geoffrey's Arthur is enormous. He's born through Merlin's magic at Tintagel. He becomes king. He defeats enemies across Britain and his conquests stretch into Europe. Rome itself comes into the story. This Arthur isn't some half-remembered warrior on the edge of the post-Roman world. He's the ruler of a magnificent Britain. Then other writers got a hold of Arthur. The Norman poet Wace introduced the Round Table in the 12th century. French Romance writers expanded Arthur's court. Chrétien de Troyes brought Lancelot into the story and helped develop the Grail tradition. And the Arthurian world we recognise starts to settle into place. That's hundreds of years of edits. King Arthur is actually less like a single character written by one author, and more like a very old shared universe where nobody bothered to maintain the continuity document.
I maintain continuity documents.
Yeah, but nobody asked, did they?
This explains your file structure.
Touché. But there is a place where you can actually watch this process escape from literature and start changing the physical world. Tintagel, a spectacular lump of rock on the north coast of Cornwall. And Tintagel really was important long before the medieval castle even appeared. Between roughly the 5th and 7th centuries, there was a wealthy settlement there, probably connected to powerful rulers in the southwest. Archaeologists have found evidence of trade stretching into the Mediterranean, so the place had real history. Then Geoffrey of Monmouth came along. In his version of Arthur's story, Tintagel becomes the place where Arthur is conceived, after Merlin magically disguises Uther Pendragon so he can enter the stronghold and sleep with Adjourna. It's a very uncomfortable story when you remove the medieval romantic fog from it, but it gives Tintagel something valuable: Arthur. Because about a century later, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, wanted the site. In 1233, he exchanged 3 manors for it. That's right, 3 whole manors for a windy chunk of Cornish coastline. Also, he could build a castle on it. And according to English heritage, the site had very little military value. The likely attraction was the story. Richard knew the Arthurian connection and seems to have deliberately built himself into it.
Clarification, please.
A medieval aristocrat read a story about King Arthur, bought the location in exchange for a bunch of fancy houses, and constructed a castle there because the story said Arthur belonged there.
Ah, so fanfiction created real estate.
That is offensively reductive, but yes. He was such an Arthur stan that he actually embedded himself into the lore. It's quite fascinating. We usually imagine legends growing around ruins. At Tintagel, the legend helped create the ruin. The story became powerful enough that a real medieval prince spent real wealth building stone walls on a cliff because Arthur was supposed to have been there. At that point, asking whether Arthur was historically real almost starts feeling like the less interesting question, because the myth certainly was. The people kept rebuilding him too. Medieval writers made Arthur a model of kingship and chivalry. Later generations rediscovered him. The Victorians loved him. Tennyson's Idol of the Kings helped make Arthur enormous again. Painters gave us shining armour, ruined kingdoms, and women staring sadly from boats. Then novels, films, television, games, even Monty Python eventually arrived and did what Britain does to anything sufficiently sacred. And Arthur, he survived that too, because there's something very adaptable about him. He can be a Celtic hero resisting invaders, a Christian king, an imperial conqueror, a tragic ruler, a democratic symbol surrounded by an equal round table. If you want Arthur to represent something, there's probably a version already available. And no, that is not permission to Rule 34 fake Grand Order King Arthur. That is not allowed. That is bad. Do not do that, and you'll probably need a VPN anyway.
Is this censored enough for the UK government?
Well, I hope so, because if not, no one's going to see this video, are they? And it'll have been a massive waste of time.
A waste of your time, maybe.
Arthur's kind of like this open source character where you can spin him any way that you want, really, which makes him incredibly useful during periods when people feel like the country has lost something. Arthur's kingdom is usually remembered backwards. We know it's doomed. Camelot becomes this brief golden period before everything goes wrong. The fellowship breaks. Lancelot and Guinevere tear apart loyalties inside the court. Mordred takes advantage. Arthur returns to fight one final battle, Camelot. The king is wounded. The kingdom is finished. And Arthur goes to Avalon. But the story leaves him alive enough to come back. This creates a powerful little political fantasy, somewhere the proper ruler still exists. Things used to work. The kingdom, it was whole. Then something was lost. And one day, someone can restore it.
The kingdom is wounded. But remember the Golden Age. The rightful leader returns. And the kingdom is restored. This is an efficient and effective narrative.
Very possibly too efficient, to be fair, because countries, they don't actually work like this. I mean, there isn't usually one moment where everything broke. Don't say Brexit. There wasn't a previous Tuesday afternoon where Britain was functioning perfectly before somebody accidentally ruined it. National decline, it's messy. And institutions, they all decay at different speeds. Industries, they slow down, they disappear as new ones emerge. Housing gets expensive, infrastructure ages. I can attest to that, as I have yet another cable stretching across my garden so I can actually have access to internet. You know, some things genuinely get worse, whilst other things were probably never as good as we remember them being anyway. All of that's horrible political messaging because it doesn't fit so easily on a mug, but you know what? Arthur does. We don't need politicians to literally dress up as King Arthur for the pattern to show up, although somebody almost certainly has. Listen for the story underneath the language. The country has been betrayed. We've lost what once made us great. The system is broken. The old establishment has failed you. Give the right person enough power and they'll finally sort it out. Different movements can tell completely different versions of that story. They can disagree on who ruined the kingdom when the Golden Age happened and who gets cast as Arthur. The shape survives, and I understand why. If things genuinely feel broken, wanting competent leadership, it's hardly irrational. And leaders do matter. Bad ones do enormous damage, and good ones make things so much better.
Your argument appears to be falling apart.
No, this is the point where I ruin my own tidy metaphor.
Unusual strategy.
Because the problem isn't hoping for good leadership. It starts when leadership becomes rescue. When one person stops being someone who can improve institutions and becomes the person who will somehow substitute for them. Strong king, wounded country, problem solved. Arthur himself should probably warn us against that. Think about it. He gets the best wizard, the best sword, the legendary knights. Depending on the version, he commands an almost absurd amount of territory, and yet Camelot still falls apart. The king simply can't hold it all together forever. There's another symbol sitting in the Arthur stories that I think is more interesting. The Round Table. Wace actually introduced it centuries after any historical Arthur would have lived. And the idea is incredibly simple. No head, no obvious position of precedence. The king is there, but so are the knights. Arthurian stories then spend a great deal of time following those knights around rather than Arthur. They leave Camelot, make a bunch of decisions, some of them fail, but they all come back. The kingdom, well, it's a network of people with obligations to each other.
Revised model available. Complexity. increased. This feels less elegant.
Unfortunately, yeah, real systems usually are, but maybe that's the part of Arthur that we've underused. We keep staring at the empty throne and asking when the king is coming back, yet the table was there the whole time. I suspect the returning king story becomes more attractive when society feels stuck, when problems are piling up and governments are changing and yet some of the problems remain. People, they lose faith in institutions, then someone arrives and says, the complexity is fake, the problem is obvious, the enemy is obvious, and fixing the country will be obvious too. Once the correct person is in charge, I'd love that to be true. Genuinely, it'd save an enormous amount of admin, wouldn't it? But the stranger lesson of Arthur is that Britain has been editing this king for perhaps 1,000 years. Every generation gets the Arthur it needs. Which means whenever somebody presents themselves as the person who can restore the kingdom, it's probably worth looking at the kingdom they're trying to ask you to remember. Was it real? Who was included in it? Who wasn't? And how much of it was built after the fact? Tintagel is still sitting on that cliff, a real castle built partly because an older story had become powerful enough to make someone build it. Sometimes nostalgia can do that. Tell the story long enough, and eventually people start constructing things inside of it. I still like the idea that Arthur is sleeping somewhere, some strange corner of the national imagination where he occasionally wakes up, looks at the news cycle and decides he's gonna give it another century. There's something reassuring about the promise that when everything gets bad enough, the king returns.
Perhaps that's why he never does.
What do you mean?
If the king returns, the waiting ends.
And then someone actually has to repair the kingdom. That's annoyingly good.
File status.
Keep it open. We might be waiting a while. Hey, if you've enjoyed today's episode, you can thank the many patrons and paid community members. They help keep the lights on, and I really appreciate you guys. If you want more amazing things, consider joining the school community. There are free books, apps, and courses. And if that's not your cup of tea, but you enjoyed the show, consider subscribing and catching up on some of the other videos. Okay, and with that, I'll see you in the next one.